Hi there, I'm Michelle Lewis. I'm a licensed clinical social worker, and in my practice, Salt Lake Weight Counseling, I specialize in emotional eating. So, what that means is I look at all the emotional barriers that are keeping you stuck in your relationship with food or in patterns of self sabotage with weight and eating. I do this in a variety of different ways, and over the course of our quick webinar today, we'll talk more about what that looks like and what you can do to move forward in your treatment of your emotional eating struggle. So, how did I get here? This is a question that a lot of clients ask. Most of the clients that I have contact me because they are concerned about their eating and because they are concerned about their weight. So, when we talk about emotional eating, what does that mean? Well, if you're not physically hungry and you're eating, there's an emotional component. That's emotional eating. If you find yourself eating random food that doesn't even taste good, that's emotional eating. And when we look at these patterns, often they have been occurring for so long that we don't even remember a time when they weren't happening. And so that can be really difficult from a change perspective to figure out how to do something different when you've never known anything different. Painful experiences. Painful experiences change our brain, which we'll talk about a little bit more, and they change the way that we think about ourselves, think about the world, and how we treat ourselves. Negative self-talk often provides a framework for a lot of what we call self-sabotage too. So think about when you make a change, when you decide, okay, I'm tired of what's happening in my relationship with food. I'm tired of eating this way. I'm sick and tired of the way that I feel. I'm going to go on this diet. And then you think about all the times when you've done this before and you couldn't sustain it, and so then you beat yourself up, and then you feel a lot of shame, and then with the shame you end up eating a box of cookies, and you're like, I don't even know how I got here. What's happening? So that shame and that negative self-talk drive the self-sabotaging behaviors, and you just end up cycling around in it over and over again. So thinking about eating as an emotional iceberg, what we see and what other people see in our relationship with food is a very small piece, much like an iceberg, of what's happening under the surface. So it's not about the food. We want to make it about the food, which is why when people go on a diet, they cut out like the whole category of food, but it's not about the food because it doesn't really matter if you're binging on cake or binging on carrot sticks. They provide the same need, like I don't want to feel, so I'm going to stuff myself so I don't have to feel what I'm feeling, but we'll talk about that a little bit more. But what's under the surface can be a lot of different things. It can be trauma. When we talk about trauma occurs on a big spectrum. So what we call big T traumas are like abuse and war and medical traumas and all those kinds of things. And then little T traumas could be someone criticizing you and everything in between. And so as we define it, a trauma is an emotional experience that has stayed with you on some level. And you might not even realize it, because let's say your boss says something about the quality of your work, and what you don't realize is that in the background, it's the voice of your dad saying, you're terrible at school. You don't know why you feel bad, but you just know like this doesn't feel good. And usually it's not necessarily about the present situation, but about everything bumping up against those past experiences. With emotional pain, and we become very good avoiders, that we don't want to feel any emotional pain. So as soon as we start to feel grief or shame or anger, we can shut that down really quickly with food so that we don't have to experience it. Unmet needs are a big piece of it. not being seen or heard by the people that we love, feeling lonely, which we'll talk about in just a minute, of disconnection too, difficulty regulating emotions. So I love Dan Siegel's work. He talks a lot about the brain. And so if you think about this as your brain, this is your prefrontal cortex, the front part of your brain. And that's the part of the brain that is formed last in brain development. And that's where we have logic and rational thought and problem solving. Well, down here we have our limbic system, which is very deep in our brain, and it's one of the earliest parts of our brain when we're babies to form. When we are emotionally triggered, the door shuts. So we've got the upstairs brain and the downstairs brain, and the door shuts, and we are stuck in that emotional center of our brain. And this part, this prefrontal cortex, is totally offline. And so when we struggle to regulate emotions, food becomes a way of bringing in some sense of safety and calm. We'll talk a little bit more about that too later on in the presentation. Stress is a big one that shuts the door, especially if we have a lot of stress and we don't know how to manage it. We will be offline, and food becomes a way of making us feel like we are online. Disconnection and loneliness is a huge factor in all of this. We don't like to be alone with our own thoughts, and we don't like to be alone with our own emotions. And if we don't have a safe person around, food becomes a pseudo substitute for that. Okay, so why food? Why do we struggle with emotional eating? There are a few reasons. So we get an increase in what are called neurotransmitters. Neurotransmitters are chemicals in our brain that help us to feel certain things or think certain things or have body sensations. And those neurotransmitters, those chemicals, can be totally hijacked by food. Specifically dopamine. So we eat sugar, we get a rush of dopamine in our brain, and it does feel good temporarily, just like using drugs. We feel good temporarily. Painful experiences change the brain. So when we experience trauma of any form, if we aren't able to fully process it and heal from it, it does actually change the structures of the brain. Along with that, if we experience something difficult and then we eat a cookie, so we experience something difficult, our sympathetic nervous system is triggered, and we eat a cookie, we put our parasympathetic nervous system online, which does actually calm the sympathetic nervous response down. And what it also does is it creates a connection in the brain that wasn't there before that says cookies resolve stress. Like if I'm stressed, I can eat a cookie. The more we go back to the food to take away that emotional experience, the stronger the connection gets. It's like going to the gym and lifting weights. And it can be very, very difficult to break. This is why when we go on a diet, those behavior changes are so hard to keep, because we still have all of those train tracks in our brain that say cookies take away stress. And if you don't have something else in its place, you're going to keep going back to the cookie. So there's that conditioned response. So when, let's say, the first time you used food for an emotional reason, let's say your stress level was at a 7, okay? Well, you do that so many times that you only have to have your stress level at like a 1 or a 2 before you're looking in the fridge over and over again, wondering what you're looking for. And because that's on autopilot, that experience is just totally on an automatic loop. And it becomes a powerful tactic to avoid uncomfortable emotions, to avoid uncomfortable thoughts, to avoid unpleasant tasks. And food's a good reason, right? It's a good excuse to not have to do the things that we don't want to do. All right, so let's talk about some behavioral contributors, some of the things that we do that set us up for emotional eating. So first, feast or famine cycle. This comes up with extreme dieting. So anytime we put ourselves in a situation where we're restricting our either our caloric intake or restricting categories of food, like I won't eat anything sweet, it triggers something in our brain that says, oh no, I really want that. I can't live without it. I need that. So even if you didn't really want it that much before, telling someone you can't have it really triggers that fear of deprivation, right? I'm thinking about, like at the beginning of the pandemic when everyone was buying massive amounts of toilet paper. Why did everyone need so much toilet paper? Well, as soon as some people started stockpiling it, everyone got so worried that they weren't going to be able to have it when they needed it. And that's that deprivation, that fear of deprivation, and that sets up that cycle with food. Skipping meals also sets up this fear of deprivation. So when we wait long periods of time between meals, sometimes our body will just take over and we'll eat a large amount of food very quickly because our body is worried that we're not going to get the need met when we need it. We use food for reward and punishment a lot. So when we make changes, often people will say, well, I can't eat dinner because I didn't go to the gym today. Or I get a cupcake because I did go to the gym. And that really sets us up for an adversarial relationship with food, like a lot of power struggles with food, and it puts an immense amount of pressure on certain types of food. And if we can start to see it more neutrally, then we don't struggle as much with this reward and punishment system. The shoulds. When we use the word should, it's generally something that we have no intent to follow through on. So like, I should go to the gym. It means that there's pressure and expectation to do it, but if your heart's not in it, you probably don't use the word should. You would say, I want to go to the gym, or I will go to the gym, or, oh, I should get a salad, when what you really want is a steak or a chicken pot pie. I don't know, random. But when you say that and then you end up doing what you shouldn't do, you beat yourself up. You tend to feel a lot of shame and guilt, unjustified guilt. When we use it with other people, we tend to feel anger and resentment. Lack of sleep is a huge, huge, huge trigger for this, and I can't understate it enough. Sleep is how our body goes through its update process, like a computer. And if we don't get enough sleep, it throws a lot of things out of whack. Specifically, if we don't get our energy through sleep, we're going to try and get it through food. And it will be the refined carbs that we'll try and eat because they're going to provide us the most immediate amount of energy. Also, our hunger and fullness hormones are recalibrated during sleep. So if we don't get enough sleep, our hunger hormone is off the charts, and our fullness hormone that tells us we've had enough food to eat is really low, and that makes it very difficult to regulate your eating. Stress is a huge contributor to it. And, in a couple of different ways, we increase our stress hormones and we're marinating in our stress hormones, and food does help us to feel better, but also it does all sorts of crazy things to our blood sugar. But also what happens when we feel stressed, when we have a lot of stuff going on, sleep is generally the first thing to go. And it's really unfortunate because it's the most insulating factor that's going to help us manage our stress more effectively. Okay, let's talk about hardwired taste. When we talk about hardwired taste, it's really what our body is conditioned to want to eat. So when we look at this from an evolutionary perspective, we want sweet, salty, and fatty foods. If we look at our caveman ancestors, sweet, salty, and fatty foods were going to provide the most immediate nutrition. They would be the most nutritionally dense foods found. Also, sweet, salty, and fatty foods are unlikely to be poisonous. So we are, through thousands of years of conditioning, primed to want these foods. The problem is that our brains have evolved to allow us to, modify all sorts of foods and make them highly processed. And when we eat highly processed foods that are sweet, salty, and fatty, these food scientists have figured out that there is something called a bliss factor. The bliss factor is the perfect proportion of sweetness, saltiness, and fattiness that helps you to go, and release the most amount of dopamine in your brain, and then you crave it, you want it. It's why McDonald's puts sugar in all of their food items, even that wouldn't seem like they would need sugar or be good with sugar, because it does increase those craving aspects, and it makes the food industry a lot of money. So they're going to continue doing that to make food as addictive as possible. What is mindless eating? So mindless eating is any time you eat and you aren't conscious of what you're eating, how much you're eating, and really paying attention to what it feels like in your body. And we are all guilty of this at one time or another. I hate to use the word guilt. We all do this at one time or another. The degree to which you eat mindlessly will dictate how much of a problem it causes in your life. But I'll talk about this popcorn experiment because I think it's a really good illustration of it. They took popcorn, let it get stale in biohazard bags for a few days, and then handed it out at a movie theater. And then just observed what was happening with the eating habits of the people. Because, movies and popcorn, they go together. It's a conditioned response. So people would eat it, but it didn't taste good at all. So they would put it down, only to unconsciously pick it back up again and start eating again. And then on some level would realize, oh, this doesn't taste good, and then put it back down. But they still ate a tremendous amount of popcorn. And it's kind of like the Costco effect, right? You go through Costco and you eat all the samples and you're not paying attention to what's happening. So then you're like, oh, I'm famished. I haven't eaten all day. I better go get something from the food court. So you've eaten some food, but you're not consciously aware of it. Plus, you're conditioned probably, if you go to the food court every time you shop at Costco, you're, even if you're not hungry, you're going to probably head toward the food court. And so really paying attention to what's happening as you're eating, really paying attention to how much you're eating and whether or not it tastes good helps to cut down on this mindless eating. But keeping food out, like let's say you have a candy bowl on your counter or on your desk and you swipe a handful every time you come by, that adds up really quickly, and we're not even satisfied by it because we're not even conscious that we're doing it. So I mentioned Dan Siegel's work earlier, and he has done a lot of work around this concept of our window of tolerance. So our window of tolerance is our ability to sit in uncomfortable emotions. And when we get knocked out of our window of tolerance, we're in one of two states. We're in hyperarousal, which is our fight or flight response. It's, that sympathetic nervous system response, and that stress response or anger, or hypoarousal, which is our freeze or dissociate response. Dissociation occurs on a spectrum. For those of you who don't know what dissociation is, it's I refer to it as the psychological form of shock. So if we're in a car accident and our body is physically injured, our brain will disconnect from the physical pain to allow us to survive. And with emotions, throughout our lives, we might encounter really uncomfortable emotional experiences, and we just need to just mentally escape from it. So when we look at it, like I said, it occurs on a spectrum. And so on the far end, if we have someone who has a horrific trauma history, they might end up with separate and distinct personalities that take over when emotional pain surfaces. So we used to call it multiple personality disorder. We call it dissociative identity disorder now. It's extremely rare, but we all dissociate to some degree. If you have ever been stressed about something and driving from one place to another and you don't remember the drive, you don't remember anything about it, you're dissociating. Scary, but I think a lot of people do it. Emotional eating is a form of dissociation. Checking out on social media is a form of dissociation. Binge watching TV is a form of dissociation. Drugs and alcohol, all forms of dissociation. And when things get too much, we need something like that to escape because our window of tolerance becomes really small. So when we engage in like the fight or hyperarousal, hypoarousal, and we're not actually dealing with what's happening and we're using tools to escape, that window of tolerance shrinks to a pretty small amount where we're just ping-ponging between hyperarousal and hypoarousal. And with a lot of the skills and tools that I teach people, we're widening that window of tolerance so that when things come up, they just don't feel so bad. With that dissociation too, using something like food to not feel, we end up in what I call a faux sense of a window of tolerance. It feels like it feels so much better than what we felt before. It feels like we're back in our window of tolerance, but we're not. We're really just like in this false sense. It's just slightly above the hypoarousal because we feel something a little bit more calm than we did before. So I'll talk a little bit about treatment and what it looks like, what I can provide, and some of the options. So I do provide individual counseling and an e-course. So I'll talk a little bit about the e-course now, and then we'll talk about a little bit more about the individual counseling. The e-course, it's all self-paced, webinar-based, and it gives you skills and tools to be able to increase that window of tolerance, to calm that nervous system, to have alternative skills so that you aren't reaching for food when you are in distress. It's based on a 6-week time frame, so there are 6 different modules, but it is self-coursed. You can go self-paced. You can go at whatever pace you want to through the course. But each module has several skills and tools to be able to manage emotions more effectively, and tangible skills that you can come back to months or even years down the road. In individual counseling, I use a variety of therapies. So I am an EMDR therapist. EMDR, if you don't know, it stands for eye movement desensitization and reprocessing, and it's the gold standard for trauma treatment. As we talked about, trauma is on spectrum. So when I'm looking at this, I'm also adding in, I use a couple of other therapies that I think are really helpful at looking at what is tied to the relationship with food. What created this need to use food for emotional reasons? Accelerated resolution therapy and comprehensive resource source model are kind of grandchildren of EMDR therapy. They just provide a few other tools to be able to bring in and create healing. And then along with that, internal family systems, which is not family therapy, it's inner child therapy, because there are always inner children who are trapped in the pain of needing food to escape or avoid or have comfort or have power, whatever the payoff is. But once we address the underlying pain that created the need to use food for emotional reasons, then I can actually use a protocol in EMDR therapy to target the best part of eating when you're not physically hungry. Is it comfort? Is it soothing? Is it avoidance? Is it relief? Is it distress? Is it all of the above? And so that we can start to break those connections that I talked about that go from, oh, I'm stressed, to food takes away stress. So we can actually change those structures in the brain to start recognizing food doesn't provide that. It provides temporary relief, but it's over as soon as I finish the bite. And create real change, real lasting change in the relationship with food. I do also use some cognitive behavioral therapy skills. Usually that's more in homework-based things because they're really tangible. And EFT tapping, love emotional freedom technique tapping, where you tap on acupressure points while looking at emotions and body sensations and distressing thoughts, and it helps to move you out of that. So cognitive behavioral therapy and EFT tapping are a lot of skills that I'll use in homework for clients to use in between sessions. Because like I said, I want you to have tools to come back to, because when I look at therapy, I want you to be able to have healing as quickly as possible, which is why I use the therapies that I do, because it's not talk therapy. It provides rapid relief relative. I mean, it depends on how deep things go. But compared to talk therapy, it's just night and day difference. But you really have to have tangible skills and tools that you can come back to, so that you aren't relying on ongoing therapy. That's not to say that, let's say we finish the work and a year from now you have something happen, or you notice things creeping back in, they can't come back in for a tune-up. Sometimes that happens, and that's totally okay. But I don't want anyone to feel dependent on me to feel okay. So I like to provide as many resources as possible. So there are a few things that I like to go over. I want to be completely transparent with who I am and what I do and what it all looks like. I do offer telehealth only. Moved out of the office and onto telehealth when COVID hit, and I really like it. And clients like the flexibility that provides. So I've stayed with telehealth, and I have no plans to go back to in-person sessions. For individual sessions, I am only licensed to provide services in Arizona, Colorado, Florida, and Utah. So if you do need healing support and you don't live in those states, I am not able to do individual sessions. But that's why I created the e-course, because I wanted to be able to provide help for people who aren't in those licensed areas. I don't participate with insurance, so it is all out of pocket, and my fee is pretty high. I recognize that. I have invested a whole lot of money into my training and into my process, and my, like I said, my goal is to be able to get people through their journey as quickly as possible. So I do charge a fee that is commensurate with that. The e-course fee is $99. So obviously that is, a lot more affordable for people, but just know that the e-course is not therapy. And if you do have, larger issues underlying everything, untreated trauma and all of that, I highly recommend working with an EMDR therapist in your area to be able to resolve those those concerns, because they are going to be very real barriers. No matter how much you use the tools, if you have untreated trauma, it's going to continue to resurface over and over again. So thank you so much for your time today. If you have any questions, or you're interested in working with me, or checking out the e-course, I'd love to have you contact me through my website, slweightcounseling.com. I can put the link to the e-course in the comments as well. And if you do have any questions about any of the information that I've gone over today, would love to hear from you. If you have suggestions, or if there are things that I didn't cover that you would like to see in a future video, I'd be happy to chat with you around that as well. Have a great day. Thank you so much.